I want to talk about what happens when black people say no. When injustice and racism have exhausted you and you responded with no. When you're tired of second-class citizenship and you declare no. When you no longer want to be on the bottom rail of society and you simply say no more. What happens? What is the response to a black no? If you've been following our work and what we've been doing through our Memory Justice Project, you know that a black no has always been met with more injustice, more brutality, more pain, more suffering. This is the third story in our Black Resistance series, where we've been exploring how black people responded to injustice, and sometimes how our response was met with even more of it. In our first story, we went back to 1887, to Pickens County, South Carolina, where a black girl named Lula Sherman suffered tremendously and lost her life. I told you how the black community responded and forced the system to make a decision about what the real purpose of lynching was. Then we went to Virginia, to a small town on the eastern shore called Onondaga, where black laborers demanded fair pay, and white employers responded with threats, with violence, and with fire, and forced expulsion. And now we come to Alabama, where the resistance of one black man in a uniform on a streetcar saying no caused more black people to speak up and also say no. Before I get into this story, I first want to give a huge thank you to all of you who've been journeying with us as we try to tell these stories of those who lived and died in injustice. Your outpouring of support has helped our Memory Justice Project and these stories reach millions, and we're so thankful to you. I also want to say a special thank you to those of you who have supported us through Patreon. Because of you, we've been able to go deeper, to investigate more, to bring forth stories that would have stayed buried. Every dollar you give helps to carry this mission forward, not just with videos, but with truth, with memory, and with impact. So thank you, truly. And if you want to join us, we'd love to have you in this community, because this is not just storytelling. It's memory work. It's history recovery, and it's growing. As I always say, you don't have to give. We're going to keep telling these stories either way. But if you want to be a part of this community with us, you can support the Memory Justice Project by visiting the link in the description. We've gained so many followers and supporters that we can't always respond to each of you, but I just wanted to thank you and take this moment to do it right here, publicly. I want you to know that your support, by viewing, sharing, and talking about this work, that it matters. Your financial support through Patreon, it matters. You are doing this work with us. And I want you to know that I appreciate it, each and every one of you. Now let me tell you what happened. Before we get to Alabama, I want to take us back for a moment, to pull back for an overhead view. If you've been following our work, you know that I rarely tell stories from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Not because those struggles weren't important, because they were. But I've spent time telling you about the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1910s and 1920s, and the 1930s. Why? Because that's the period that historian Rayford Logan called the nadir of race relations, the lowest point. It was the era between the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, a period of intense racial violence and legal abandonment, where black life was targeted and forgotten, not overlooked, not faintly remembered, completely forgotten, as if we were not human and never existed. I've told you stories of entire black families being wiped out, black towns being destroyed, thousands attending the burning alive of a black person and calling it justice, black women being violated and their attackers being freed because they said that black women wanted it and weren't deserving of protection. The deepest, darkest forms of human depravity, all at the expense of black people. Some historians have called it the worst period for black people outside of slavery. Now, not a lot of attention has been given to black history, to our story, to what we endured, and even less is being given today. And it's easy to overlook this period, the nadir. Because of that, it's easy to think that Jim Crow was just in the South, that he never went north. It's easy to think that black people just lived with it, and we were fine until Dr. King and Rosa Parks showed up in 1955. I reject that, because it's a false view that black people did not resist. It ignores the fact that we struggled and suffered every day of every year, of every decade, of every century that we've been here. Not one peaceful day for us. But we have survived. And we survived because we resisted. A people that does not resist is a people that fades from the earth. We are still here, still surviving, still resisting. And the case I'm going to tell you about in this video is another example of why we are still here. This case is one of thousands that happened during the Nadir. Edgar Charles Caldwell was born on May 18, 1892 in Greenville, South Carolina. He later joined the Army, where he became a decorated soldier in the 14th Infantry Regiment. Edgar served in the Philippines for 2 years as a sharpshooter. In 1912, he was honorably discharged. Eventually, he made his way to Atlanta, where he worked as a bottler for the Red Rock Bottling Company. When World War I came around, Edgar enlisted again. This is his actual draft card. It was also around this time that Edgar met and married a woman named Trese Ford. After re-enlisting, he was sent to Camp McClellan in Anderson, Alabama. And no longer was he Private Caldwell. He had been promoted to the rank of sergeant. Things are starting to look up for Edgar. But it's when you look up, that's when Jim Crow comes to knock you back down. One of the most violent periods in the Nadir came right after World War I, when black men were returning home from war. The end of war created mass hysteria, a fear that black soldiers would come home feeling entitled to equality, that somehow their service to their country meant they were owed dignity, owed justice. Jim Crow and his followers would have none of that. And that's not just me saying this. Newspapers at the time openly warned about the danger of returning black soldiers. They feared that military training had made us uppity, that uniforms had made us forget our place. They feared the kind of black man who had seen the world and knew he deserved better than second-class citizenship. I've talked with you about this before. We've covered stories from this very period, the Red Summer of 1919, where racial violence erupted all across the country. Black people were lynched, black communities attacked, and black veterans in particular were singled out. You can watch our videos on Maurice Mays and Barry Washington and the Cavanagh family to learn more about some of the riots that took place. As black soldiers were fighting in Europe, they experienced something they had never known at home. A world where equality was possible, where freedom wasn't just a dream, it was a reality. And while black men were fighting abroad, a very different kind of battle was brewing back here at home. A wave of fear, a national debate, a panic over one question. How would America deal with a militant black man? A black man trained in combat, dressed in uniform, coming home with dignity. You see, you have to understand, this was a real fear. Not something that we're theorizing about 100 years later. They were saying it then, in newspapers, in government reports, in conversations behind closed doors. And this fear tells you something critical about Jim Crow. He was not working on autopilot. He was active. He was strategic. He was calculating how to keep us down, to keep us subservient, to keep his injustice train rolling. He didn't want us to rise in freedom, only to sink back into despair. He didn't see us successful in the future, only chained to the bondage of his past. And that's important because it tells you something else, that they knew what they were doing to us was wrong. This wasn't just the way things were back then. They knew. And they just didn't care. Almost as soon as black men began to be drafted into the military, white commentators started asking this question: what's going to happen when they come back? In October of 1917, the editor of the New Republic said it plainly. What disturbed the South most was not black soldiers going abroad, but what they might expect when they come home. He presented this question: would black men still accept white rule as they had in the past? Would he still shrink from a white man's blow, or would he fight back? And it wasn't just journalists. Politicians were just as concerned. Defenders of the old Confederacy and of white rule feared they were losing their grip. For many, the return of black soldiers, trained to fight, respected overseas, and now expecting dignity, was not a cause for honor. It was a threat, and one they believed had to be taken seriously. Mississippi Senator James Vardaman was particularly enraged. Like many supporters of Jim Crow, he was obsessed with the idea of black men in France having been with white women, and now returning home with the desire to do the same. He used his own publication, Vardaman's Weekly, to spread the message. He wrote that every community in Mississippi should organize the bravest and best white men to monitor what he called military French women ruined Negro soldiers, to let them know they were under surveillance. And Vardaman didn't just write this in his paper. He said it publicly. In August of 1917, on the floor of the United States Senate, Vardaman gave a speech warning the nation. He said that once a black soldier came to see himself as an American hero, his untutored soul will be inflated with military errors. According to Vardaman, black and white people in the South could never live together on equal terms. And the return of black soldiers with dignity and pride and a uniform will lead to what he called a disaster. Violence targeting black soldiers started as soon as the armistice was signed. The moment the war was over in Europe, the moment black soldiers stopped fighting the Kaiser abroad, they had to start fighting Jim Crow at home. In December of 1918, the very same month as the Edgar Caldwell incident, Private Charles Lewis was taken from his jail cell and lynched in Kentucky after being accused of robbery. They had fought for this country, risked their lives in uniform. Some returned with medals, others with wounds. All returned with pride. But Jim Crow saw something else. He saw black men in uniform, walking tall, wearing dignity, demanding respect. And they took it as a threat. All across the South and in parts of the North, that pride was met with violence. It was targeted. It was deliberate. From the moment the war ended, black soldiers were attacked in the streets, harassed on streetcars, pulled from jail cells, lynched by mobs, and railroaded into courtrooms. 16 black veterans were lynched between 1918 and 1920. I took the time to explain all of this because I want you to understand. Racism was not abstract. It wasn't just something that black people happened to be born into. It was structured, developed, deliberate. Decisions had to be made every single day. Decisions about who was going to remain on top and who was going to remain on the bottom. And black people always found themselves on the unjust side of that equation. This was the world that we lived in, trying to survive, trying to make it, when every day the goalpost was moved. Not just down the field, but to an entirely new location. Every day being told to play a game that was designed for you to lose. Everyone else was being told the rules, how to win, how to succeed. But when you showed up to the game, they just said one thing to you: you're going to lose. But you still had to play anyway. And this was the world that Edgar Caldwell was in. Not just a world that hated him for who he was, but now he and other black soldiers were hated for what they had experienced, for what they had tasted. Freedom, dignity, equality. And black soldiers didn't just surrender. They didn't surrender to the Kaiser in Europe, and they weren't going to surrender to Jim Crow at home. They didn't shrink. They didn't bow. They resisted. And Edgar, he resisted. He stepped right into the fight at home. And let me tell you what happened. Edgar had been transferred to Camp McClellan from Camp Gordon in Georgia in the fall of 1918. He was one of 5,000 black soldiers assigned to the 157th Depot Brigade. Their orders? Grueling, back-breaking labor. They hauled lumber, built roads, and cleared debris. They were treated like convicts, worked like mules, punished for existing. And when the day was done, Edgar and the others were crammed into poorly built tents, living in filth, with almost no sanitation. It got so bad that just days before this incident, a black soldier at Camp McClellan wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois. He told Du Bois that black soldiers were being made to do all the hard work, while white soldiers were being sent home. He begged the NAACP to help them get honorable discharges from the Army. And in Anniston, where Edgar was stationed, it wasn't just the base conditions that made his life miserable. It was the city itself. Like I told you earlier, Southerners didn't want uniform and power black men believing they'd be treated equally. And the people of Anniston, they were no different. White leaders there enforced Jim Crow fiercely. And in preparation for black troops arriving in town, city authorities had local black ministers and leaders hold meetings with the soldiers from Camp McClellan to tell them how to behave, how to stay in their place, how not to cross the color line. The tension between Jim Crow's rules and a black soldier's desire for dignity, it was building. And it came to a boiling point on December 13th. Sunday, December 13th, 1918, was supposed to be a regular day for Edgar. He only planned to relax, to enjoy a day out, away from the camp. Edgar was going to Hobson City, an all-black town about 8 miles outside of Anniston. He wanted to get away, to be around other black people, to be himself. Just Edgar. Not the black soldier, not a boy, just Edgar Caldwell. He put on his khaki and wool non-commissioned officer uniform, grabbed his pass, which gave him permission to leave the base, and boarded Alabama Power Company's Constantine line. So far, so good, I'm sure he thought. Later, he boarded the Oxford Lake streetcar and headed into Anniston. But as soon as he got on that streetcar, Jim Crow was waiting. Edgar boarded, paid his fare, and sat down. But the conductor, a white man named Cecil Linton, took notice of him. He accused Edgar of not paying his fare, and he was furious that Edgar sat in the white section of the car. And that was it. That small act was about to lead to deadly consequences. It was in transportation, on trains and buses and streetcars, where segregation, racism, and injustice sat side by side, where Jim Crow's rules weren't just spoken, they were fiercely enforced. On streetcars, black people were constantly reminded that you were on the bottom. Don't rise, don't look up, don't even think about it. Just take your seat. But it wasn't just a seat. It was a line that you better not cross, a warning that you better heed. But at the same time, it was in those very same seats that black people dared to challenge the caste system, to say no, to resist. That's what Edgar was doing that Sunday when he stepped onto their streetcar. And Linton, he wasn't just going to let this go. To be clear, we don't know exactly what the sequence of events was. White papers framed it as an incident that started because a black man broke Jim Crow's rules by sitting in the white section. But black commentators said that this wasn't the real issue. They said the conflict started because Edgar took offense to Linton trying to cheat him out of his fare. No matter the exact reason, we know what happened next. We also know this. Linton was outraged by Edgar. This proud black man standing in his uniform, daring to speak up for himself. Edgar thought too highly of himself, and Linton was going to show him exactly what he thought about his uniform and about his sacrifice and about his service in defense of freedom. He was going to remind Edgar that his uniform meant nothing to him. He was still black in the Jim Crow South, and he better follow Jim Crow's rules, or else. Linton ordered Edgar off the streetcar, and when Edgar didn't move fast enough, Linton tried to throw him off, but Edgar resisted. He pushed Linton backward, slammed him to the glass divider, and shattered it, sending shards of glass flying onto passengers. That's when Linton called for help. The motorman, a man named Kelsey Morrison, he came rushing in. Together, the two white men punched Edgar in the face. They grabbed him, tried to rip him off the car. All three of them tumbled off the streetcar and onto the street. Edgar hit the ground, flat on his back. And now the two white men were standing over him, beating him and kicking him. But the beating wasn't enough. Edgar had to be taught a lesson about the rules, about his place. And that's when Morrison picked up a heavy piece of iron and raised it above his head to strike Edgar. What neither of these men knew was that Edgar Caldwell wasn't just a black man in uniform. He was armed that day with a service weapon. Still on the ground, Edgar pulled out his pistol and fired twice. The first round struck Linton in the chin and traveled up into the top of his head. The second round hit Morrison, passing close to his heart and landed in his neck. When it was over, Cecil Linton was dead, and Kelsey Morrison was clinging to life. Do you remember how this day started? Edgar getting up, just wanting a day to himself. A day to relax, a day to breathe, a day to be Edgar. Not the black soldier, not the threat, not the problem, just a man, living and existing. A day where his race didn't dictate how much injustice he was going to suffer that day, how many insults he'd have to swallow, and say, "No, sir, I don't have a problem. No, sir, whatever you want." How many times he'd have to just smile through it and move on. Just a day to be. That's all he wanted. That's all any black person wanted. But you couldn't just be, because you always had to take a back seat to Jim Crow. And in this case, literally, a seat in the back of the streetcar. This is the suffocating nature of racism and injustice. Normal was not normal. A Sunday was not just a Sunday. For black people, every moment had to be watched, every step measured, every word weighed. You had to move through life in a way that made sure that you didn't run afoul of Jim Crow, because he was always waiting for you to put you in your place, the one that he created for you. You smile too wide or too long, he knocked the smile off your face. You sing a song of joy, he stripped the joy from your song and dragged you right back into despair. His world was sunny and blue. Yours was dark and gloomy. We can't pretend to know exactly what Edgar was thinking, but I think it's fair to say he didn't get up that morning planning to take a white man's life. He didn't wake up hoping to put himself squarely in Jim Crow's crosshairs. But that's what happened. And what happened on that streetcar, that was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. There's still more resistance to come. After firing, Edgar knew he had to get out of there. Things were only going to get worse from here. There was no good ending that could come if he stayed. No explanation that he could give. No one would listen. So he ran. He ran towards the hills outside of the city. As he was running, word was spreading through the county about what had just happened. By that night, a mixed group of soldiers and military police and sheriff's deputies and city police and white townsmen came together to form some kind of posse. And they had one goal: to find Edgar. The posse searched everywhere, through the hills, through the woods, and through the streets. And the more they searched, the angrier the town became. In downtown Anniston, a mob of white men began looking for someone, somebody black to take their rage out on. That's when a black man happened to walk into their path. He was a porter. He had no idea what was going on. He was just on his way, not looking for trouble. The mob attacked him. Hundreds of white men chased him and fired at him. Their reason? They said he cursed at a white woman. That black man barely made it out alive. He survived only because police officers saw what was happening and pulled him from the mob before they could lynch him. But instead of taking him home, they put him in jail, said it was for his own protection. There's one more thing I want to say about the aftermath period, something I found in the research. And I'll be honest, I went back and forth on whether I'd even share it with you. But I think you'll find it just as disturbing and revealing as I did. So we know the confrontation between Edgar and Linton started with enforcing Jim Crow's rules. A black man in uniform, refusing to be disrespected. But in the aftermath, while they were still searching for Edgar, another element was added. One that Jim Crow always knew how to weaponize against black people, against black men in particular. Sex, morality, blackness, and white womanhood. Let me explain what I mean. Between July and November of 1918, over 80 black women were arrested in Anniston's black neighborhoods for what police called immoral conduct. Authorities claimed soldiers were crossing into those neighborhoods for drinking and prostitution. And one of the reasons people gave for Linton's death was that Edgar was headed to that part of town for immoral reasons, to be with a loose and immoral black woman. But that wasn't all. Suddenly, white womanhood was pulled into the story. Even though Linton's wife had nothing to do with it, wasn't even there, she was made into the victim. Papers reported that she lived just blocks away and heard the shots that made her a widow. Some people claim that she died from shock. And even when that rumor was denied, the papers kept leaning in, calling her prostrated with grief, a mother left without a provider, a wife left defenseless. So now you have this story. Black women, the immoral cause, a black man, the violent actor, a white woman, the innocent casualty. And by framing it that way, they stoked more outrage, more fear, more justification for whatever came next. Because that's what Jim Crow always did. He turned every confrontation to a defense of himself, as if he had been attacked. And he made every act of black resistance feel like an assault on their entire way of life. As Edgar was on the run, I thought about him. More specifically, what he was thinking. When we tell these stories, there's a desire to rush to the next part, to get to the action, to say, what happened next? But in that rush, you lose the real moments, the human ones. This wasn't just a moment in history. This was something real, something that a black man lived through and carried and felt. Edgar was 26 years old, newly married, a decorated soldier, a sergeant. And just moments earlier, he had taken the life of a white man in Alabama at a time when lynching a black man was treated like just another community event. What went through his mind as he ran, as he moved through the streets and into the trees, with the weight of his footsteps, racing to outrun the weight of what had just happened? Did he think about Trese, the love that they were just beginning, whether he'd ever get the chance to see what it could grow into? Did he wonder what would happen to him? Would it be quick? Would it be slow? Would it be painful? Would they let him speak? Let him explain that he had no choice, that he defended himself the way they trained him to? What went through his mind? That's the thing I kept wondering. Because yes, Edgar was running for his life, but maybe he was also trapped in his thoughts. Edgar was caught just a few hours after the incident by a military policeman named James O'Melia. Now you would think, since Edgar was active duty at the time, serving in uniform as a sergeant in the United States Army, that the military would have stepped in, taken jurisdiction, launched a court-martial if they felt necessary, handled it internally by their own code. But that's not what happened. In a strange but not so strange move, the military turned Edgar over to Alabama civilian authorities. But here's something I want us to sit with for a moment. Jim Crow didn't just operate on its own. He needed people, individuals to act or to look away, to make decisions or to protect injustice with silence. The same people in charge of deciding what would happen to Edgar, they weren't outsiders to the system. They were the system. These were the same officers who had allowed black soldiers at Camp McClellan to suffer, to be overlooked, mistreated, and ignored. And now a black man had taken the life of a white man and injured another one. And there was pressure from the town, from white troops, from the mob. Colonel J.H. Lewis made the decision. He surrendered Edgar to local authorities, but not before surrounding him with troops. Not to protect Edgar's rights, not because he believed that Edgar deserved fairness, but because he couldn't let the mob lynch an active duty soldier. That would make the Army look weak, undisciplined, and out of control. So instead, they handed Edgar over to be rushed to trial. This appeased the mob while still asserting the Army's power. And that's how Jim Crow worked. It didn't just survive on hate. It ran on decisions, on appearances, on control, on men who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. Now that Edgar was in civilian custody, it was time for Jim Crow to show how he operated the courts too. How he wasn't just mob violence. He was the law. He was the courtroom, the judge, the jury. He was the outcome. Because make no mistake about it, this was not going to be due process. This was not going to be justice. This was formality, the appearance of fairness, a carefully staged performance with a verdict already waiting in the wings. A preliminary hearing was held on Wednesday. That's the type of hearing meant to determine if there's enough evidence to even go to trial. But at Anniston, anger was still thick in the air. There were still people who wanted Edgar dead, wanted to lynch him. So he had to be escorted into the courtroom by both police and armed military guards. The courtroom was packed. The judge, Hugh D. Merrill, appointed a local lawyer, Charles D. Klein, to represent Edgar. One by one, a half a dozen witnesses took the stand. They all pointed to Edgar. They all said he was the man who fired the shots on the streetcar. At the end of the hearing, Judge Merrill said that he had no choice but to hold Edgar over for trial. The very next day, a grand jury was convened. Same judge, same courthouse, same appearance and procedure. A dozen more witnesses came forward, all pointing to Edgar, all echoing the same script. The entire grand jury session lasted just 90 minutes, and when it was over, they indicted Edgar Caldwell for taking the life of Cecil Linton. No justice, just speed and certainty. Because in Jim Crow's courtroom, black guilt didn't need to be proven. It only needed to be processed. I've told enough of these stories to recognize the rhythm of injustice, how fast it moves, how rehearsed it feels. And let me explain what I mean by that. So for those of you who don't know, my day job is as a lawyer. I'm a litigator. And I've been in courtrooms hundreds of times. And one thing I always say is this: people usually meet me on the worst day of their lives. If I'm representing you, something has gone wrong. And when I'm in court making an argument or talking to the judge or standing in front of a jury, there's a rhythm to what's happening. The lawyers know it. The judge knows it. The clerk, the bailiff, the court reporter. We all know what's going on. Sometimes it feels like it's running on autopilot. We're using legal terms, some in Latin, making arguments about procedure, referencing rules, filing deadlines, and statutes. But you know what I've seen time and time again? I'll finish making the argument, come back to counsel's table, and my client turns to me and says, "What just happened?" They heard every word, but they didn't understand what was really going on. They didn't realize the ruling that had just come down, that they're about to be detained, that they're about to lose custody, that their lawsuit has just been dismissed, that the favorable piece of evidence for them is not coming in, that the decision's already been made. We all saw it, we all heard it, but they didn't, because it all moved too fast. So when I read about these stories, especially when we get to the courtroom, I put on my legal hat, and I see it immediately. I see the rhythm of a courtroom being used for injustice. I read these transcripts from Jim Crow trials, and I see the right words being said. The lawyers making objections. The judges giving instructions. The witnesses taking the stand. But it's all for show, because everything, every motion, every ruling is leaning toward the same destination: injustice. And I wonder, what was going through the mind of the black person sitting there? What was Edgar thinking? Did he think he had a chance? That someone might come forward and tell the truth? Then maybe the system would see that he was attacked, and all he did was defend himself. This is what racism does. It takes what should be fair, what should be impartial, and perverts it into something else. A formality, a show. A system designed to produce only one outcome: injustice. Though Edgar wasn't from Anniston, the local black community quickly rallied around him. They saw what was happening. They knew what this was, and they refused to let him face it alone. They pooled their money, passed hats, and knocked on doors, and raised enough funds to bring in help. And not just any help. They hired Basil Allen, a well-known lawyer from Birmingham, a former judge, respected and seasoned. He joined Edgar's court-appointed attorney, Charles Klein, to build a defense for a man they knew was fighting for his life. The trial began just a few weeks later, on January 17, 1919. Edgar was prosecuted by county solicitors J.B. Sanford and James F. Matthews, but they weren't the only ones coming for him. The Alabama Power Company, the same company that ran the streetcar, decided to get involved. They brought in big guns. One of their lawyers was Neil Stern, Yale-educated, deeply connected to Alabama's white power structure, and more than ready to help make sure that Jim Crow had the last word. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. It wasn't designed to be. It was going to be a trial, but not the kind where truth mattered. On the day of the trial, a large group of black people showed up to support Edgar. They filled every seat in the courtroom, lined every wall, until it was packed from front to back. And that's when Judge Hugh Merrill cleared the courtroom, because black support, even quiet and seated, was a threat to the system. Attorneys Klein and Allen got to work immediately. Their first move was a motion to dismiss the case. They argued that the grand jury which indicted Edgar was unlawful, that it had already been discharged the term before, and the new grand jury should have been convened. But that argument went nowhere. Judge Merrill denied the motion. The trial would proceed. The prosecution went to work building their narrative. They painted Edgar as an aggressor, leaning heavily into the most dangerous Jim Crow era tropes. He was cast as both a wild, violent savage and, at the same time, a trained and calculated man. This was no accident. It was intentional. This wasn't just about depicting Edgar as dangerous. It was about sending a message about all black soldiers returning from war, men who had been trained to fight, who had seen the world, who now carried with themselves dignity and pride. And that made them a threat. Because in their mind, this crazed beast had now been taught to take life and handed the tools to do it. The prosecution's case against Edgar was about more than one man on one streetcar. It was about control. They wanted to make an example of Edgar to say, this is what happens when you let them loose. This is what happens when black men are trained and armed and stop accepting their place. This wasn't just a trial. It was a performance. It was a warning. And Edgar Caldwell was the one they chose to put on display. The defense put forward an interesting theory. Now, I've told you what happened, that Edgar acted in self-defense, that he was attacked, beaten, and did what any soldier trained to survive would do. But that's not the strategy his attorneys used at trial, and there's a reason for that. Because portraying Edgar as a black man who defended himself, who pulled a weapon and fired back at two white men, might have incited the jury just as much as saying that he intended to take a white man's life. This courtroom was not neutral ground, and everyone knew it. So attorneys Allen and Klein made a calculated decision. They carefully pushed back on the prosecution's version of events, pointing out contradictions, challenging claims, raising doubt. Then they went further. They argued that someone else had fired those fatal shots. Yes, they said Edgar did fight both men. Yes, there was a struggle. But no, he did not pull the trigger. He didn't take Linton's life. That was the story they gave the jury. And Edgar, he didn't testify. He had a Fifth Amendment right not to. And honestly, that was the best decision that they could have made for him. Because putting Edgar on the stand in front of that jury, a black serviceman standing up for himself, that would not have helped him. It would have only given the jury a chance to harden their prejudices, to see defiance instead of defense, to see a threat instead of a man. And in the Jim Crow courtroom, that could be the difference between a sliver of hope and no chance at all. After hearing all the evidence, the case went to the all-white jury. They deliberated for only 2 hours before convicting Edgar Caldwell. And Judge Hugh Merrill, he wasted no time. He sentenced Edgar to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for August 15, 1919. Edgar's attorneys filed a motion for a new trial. It was denied very quickly. But remember how the story started. It started with resistance, with Edgar standing up on that streetcar, refusing to be disrespected, refusing to be beaten. And now, with Edgar facing death, the resistance didn't end. It shifted. Because the black community stepped in to continue this fight, to resist on Edgar's behalf, to try to save him. Black people in Anniston had already been organizing. They had raised money to hire Edgar's defense team. They packed the courtroom in support. And when the guilty verdict came down, when they saw just how fast injustice could move, they didn't stop. In fact, they had just formed their own local chapter of the NAACP, led by black businessmen, pastors, and community leaders who knew exactly what they were up against. And they got to work. Reverend Roland Williams reached out to the National NAACP office in New York, and he requested help. In a letter to his secretary, John Shalady, Reverend Williams laid it out plainly. He said Edgar didn't get a fair trial. He said that every black juror had been struck and removed from the jury before it even began. And they made one more point too. Edgar was a U.S. soldier, still in uniform, and he never should have been tried in a civilian court to begin with. Now before I move on, I want to pause and address something that you might be wondering about. You just saw a picture of the head of the NAACP at that time, John Shalady. And yes, you saw correctly. He was a white man. The NAACP was formed in 1919, and while black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois were deeply involved from the beginning, there were also prominent white board members and officers in leadership roles, including Shalady. I don't want to get too deep into the history right now, but I thought it was worth noting, especially as we talk about who took action in Edgar's case. Now let me tell you what happened next. Shalady was already aware of Edgar's case by the time he received Reverend Roland Williams' letter. He'd been following it in the newspapers. But that wasn't a cause for celebration, because the NAACP had serious concerns about whether they could get involved in Edgar's case. Shalady consulted with the organization's legal committee, and the fear was this. If the NAACP, a northern civil rights organization, stepped into the middle of a high-profile case in Alabama, it could backfire. It could hurt Edgar's chance of gaining clemency from the governor. It could make things worse. So Shalady wrote back to Reverend Williams to give him the news. He told him that they were hesitant and suggested that he work with local NAACP chapters in the South instead. But Reverend Williams was not deterred. He didn't accept that. He kept writing, kept pushing, kept sending letters to the national office. And he didn't stop there. He also wrote to the War Department, arguing that Edgar was a soldier and that what happened to him was not just a local issue. This was a matter for the military to look into. To Reverend Williams' surprise, the War Department actually wrote back. And for the first time, someone in power acknowledged something that could change everything. The military police had made a mistake. They never should have turned Edgar over to civilian authorities. But even with that admission, the War Department said there was nothing they could do. It was out of their hands. If anything was going to happen now, it would have to come from the Department of Justice. But that brought a new challenge, because the DOJ was led by A. Mitchell Palmer, a man who despised the NAACP. He saw it as a radical organization, dangerous and disruptive. Still, the black leaders in Anniston refused to give up. They kept writing, kept organizing, and eventually, they convinced John Shalady to send a formal letter to Palmer and the DOJ. But time was running out. Edgar's execution was now just 4 months away, and something had to be done now. Let me say this. There was so much that happened behind the scenes on Edgar's behalf. A lot. More than I can fully get into in this video. If I told you the names of everyone who stepped in, every letter written, every meeting held, every move made, we'd be here for at least 3 to 4 hours. So I'm going to do my best to summarize what has taken scholars hundreds of pages to explain. So stick with me through this next part, please, because this isn't just dry legal history or courtroom procedure. This was a fight for a man's life. And that fight stretched across different branches of government, raising questions about states' rights, federal power, and military authority, all while Jim Crow loomed over every decision. And that's actually why I found this story so compelling, why I knew I had to include it in this Black Resistance series. It was this part of the story, this kind of resistance, not just on the streetcar, but in the letters, in the petitions, in the organizing, the refusal to give up. That's what made me say, this is a story that has to be told. And while all this was unfolding behind closed doors, Edgar was still sitting in a jail cell. A man, waiting to die, wondering if any of this would actually save him. As things began picking up, and the NAACP started mobilizing on Edgar's behalf, time was running out. His attorneys filed an appeal to the Alabama Supreme Court, hoping the judges would overturn the verdict. But the reality was, no one was holding their breath. And around the same time, a young NAACP leader was brought into the fight, Walter White. He was serving as the organization's assistant secretary. And I've talked about the future leader of the NAACP in several videos before. He was smart, fearless, and deeply committed to the cause. White worked alongside the NAACP's attorney, James A. Cobb, to build the legal strategy they used to try to get Edgar's case into federal court. And the argument they chose? It came straight from the letter that Reverend Williams had sent months earlier. That Edgar should have never been turned over to Alabama civilian authorities in the first place. That he was still a U.S. soldier. He should have been court-martialed, not handed over to face a mob in a sham trial. This wasn't just about Edgar anymore. His case had become a national issue for the NAACP. Black soldiers were coming home from war and walking straight back into violence, into Jim Crow, into danger. The NAACP knew Edgar would not be the last. So they wanted a federal court to step in, to say clearly and without question that black soldiers had rights, they deserved protection, and what happened to Edgar Caldwell could not become the norm. Unsurprisingly, the Alabama Supreme Court upheld the lower court's verdict. But Edgar's attorneys didn't give up. They filed a request for a second hearing. And while the court reviewed this new request, Edgar was granted a temporary stay of execution. The legal fight inside the courtroom is still alive, and outside the courtroom, the pressure campaign was heating up too. Now remember, John Shalady, the NAACP's national secretary, had already written to U.S. Attorney General Abe Mitchell Palmer about Edgar's case. And here's where things took a surprising turn. To Shalady's shock, Palmer didn't just ignore it. He actually forwarded the letter to President Woodrow Wilson. And if that's not shocking enough, Wilson responded. He said Edgar's case should be investigated. Wilson wrote to Alabama Governor Thomas Kilby, asking him to grant a temporary reprieve to give the Attorney General time to look into the case. Now here's the thing though, their request wasn't really necessary because Edgar had already been given a stay of execution from the Alabama Supreme Court. But still, a sitting president has stepped in, and that was not nothing, especially in a case like this. But let me be clear, it wasn't just luck that caused the federal government and even President Wilson to take action. The NAACP has someone on the inside, a black man named Emmett Scott. Scott was a trusted advisor. He had served as special assistant to the Secretary of War during World War I. He had access, and he used it. It was Scott who raised Edgar Caldwell's case with Joseph Tumulty, the White House secretary. That conversation is what got the ball rolling. And Scott didn't just stop there. He secured a meeting between Edgar's defense team and Assistant Attorney General Harry Stewart. During that meeting, they laid out their argument plainly. At most, Edgar Caldwell was guilty of manslaughter, not intentionally taking Linton's life. And even more importantly, because he was an active duty soldier, the federal government, not Alabama, should have had jurisdiction from the beginning. His attorneys left that meeting with hope. Stewart listened. He didn't just shut them down. Now, I've got to pause for just 1 second, because when I came across the name Emmett Scott in this story, I had to do some digging. And I hope you don't mind if I take just a moment to tell you a little bit about him. Because I believe it's important that black people who helped in our stories of struggle, that they aren't just forgotten. Emmett Scott was one of the most influential and overlooked black leaders in the early 20th century. He started his career as a journalist in Texas, but his real rise came when he became the closest advisor to Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee, the man they called Washington's right-hand man. During World War I, President Woodrow Wilson appointed him as Special Assistant for Negro Affairs to the Secretary of War. That made him the highest-ranking black person in the federal government at the time, and gave him a front-row seat to both the promise and the pain of black military service. And it's because of that position, his long-standing reputation as a behind-the-scenes operator, that he was able to get Edgar Caldwell's case in front of the White House. And he did a whole lot more, but I don't want to get too far away from my story, and perhaps I'll come back to him in a later video, but I just wanted to tell you just a little bit about him. So getting back to our story. On October 23, 1919, the Alabama Supreme Court made its decision. They refused to hear Edgar's appeal for a new trial, and they set a new execution date, December 5th. But here's what makes that day even more disturbing. On the very same day the court all but guaranteed Edgar will be hanged, another court in Alabama was letting a white man walk free for taking the life of a black soldier. J.D. Summerlin, a streetcar conductor in Birmingham, got into an argument with Private John Green over the correct change. And then he pulled out a pistol and he executed Green. Summerlin was indicted, but he was acquitted after an 18-minute trial. While Edgar sat in jail, waiting to die, Summerlin walked free. That verdict crushed what little hope the NAACP had that the Alabama courts would step in to save Edgar Caldwell. And remember earlier when I talked about the formality of courtroom injustice, how it moved fast, how it spoke in legal codes and rituals, how it was all designed to work against black people. Well, Summerlin's case was the same machine in reverse, because Jim Crow didn't just use the courts to punish us, he used them to protect his own, to shield his followers, to excuse them. Justice, it was whatever Jim Crow said it was, and if that meant staging a trial, walking through the motions just to reach a not guilty verdict for someone everyone knew was guilty, then so be it. Because that's what the system was built to do. With all options in Alabama closed off, Edgar's legal team had two remaining paths: the president and the military. At first, there was hope that the president might step in, but the NAACP wasn't that optimistic about that. They knew how unlikely it was for a Democratic president to intervene in the Democratic South, so they turned their focus to the War Department. They had a strong argument. Edgar was an active duty soldier, and under the Articles of War, he should have never been tried by the state in the first place. James A. Cobb, the NAACP's attorney, he laid all of this out in a detailed letter to Secretary of War Newton Baker. He even cited a recent case in Kentucky where a white National Guardsman took the life of a white police officer. In that case, the military stepped in, and the court ruled that the soldier should be under military, not civilian control, So why not Edgar? That's what Cobb and Charles Klein argued when they met with the acting judge advocate general, Enoch Crowder. Cobb told him point blank, this was not justice. If the state didn't have jurisdiction, then executing Edgar would be no different than lynching him. But still, Crowder refused to intervene. After the War Department refused to help, Edgar's legal team made one last push to get support from the president. Emmett Scott met again with President Wilson's secretary, and for a moment, things looked promising. He was told the Department of Justice might get involved, but that hope didn't last long. In December, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer backed out. By January 1920, his office made it official. They would no longer be involved. According to James Cobb, Alabama politicians had pressured Palmer behind the scenes and convinced him to drop the case. Cobb believed that he knew the real reason. Palmer had ambitions to run for president, and he didn't want to upset Southern voters. Before I move on, I want to say this, because we've been talking about all the players in this case. The White House, the Justice Department, the War Department, the Alabama Supreme Court. But what about Edgar? While all of this was going on, while letters were being written, arguments made, power brokers moved, Edgar Caldwell was still sitting in a jail cell, waiting to die. And we can't lose sight of that. All of that legal maneuvering, it didn't feel like hope to him. It didn't feel like progress, because the state of Alabama still planned to execute him. That was the only thing that felt real. He wasn't in those rooms. He wasn't in the meetings. He was alone, counting the days. How can you hope when all you think about is what's about to happen? And I want us to remember that while this story is about politics and systems and power, at the center of it all was a man, a black man, a husband, a soldier, who was living every second of this pain, not as history, but as his reality. The loss of the Attorney General's support was a heavy blow to Edgar's case, but all was not lost. Because in late 1919, his attorneys have filed a writ of habeas corpus in federal court in Alabama. That's a legal petition that argues that someone is being unlawfully held. Federal Judge William Grubb denied the writ, but he did something else, something important. He issued a stay of execution and granted a certificate of probable cause. That small action gave Edgar one more chance, a path to appeal his conviction to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's exactly what his attorneys did. Now that his case was headed to the Supreme Court, the NAACP began publicizing it more widely. They also ramped up their fundraising efforts to help cover the cost of additional legal support. W.E.B. Du Bois even published a lengthy editorial in the January 1920 issue of the Crisis magazine about Edgar's case, connecting to larger issues in fairness and equity in the justice system. On March 4th and 5th, the case of Edgar Caldwell versus the state of Alabama finally reached the highest court in the land. Attorneys James A. Cobb, Charles Klein, and Arthur Davis stood before the United States Supreme Court, and they argued that Edgar should be spared, not just because of what happened on their streetcar, but because the state of Alabama never had the legal right to try him in the first place. He was a soldier, an active duty serviceman, and according to the law, his case belonged in a military court. That was the heart of their argument. But Alabama pushed back. Their team, led by Neil Stern, the same lawyer brought in by the streetcar company, insisted that the state had jurisdiction, that everything about Edgar's trial was lawful. And now it was up to the U.S. Supreme Court to decide, was Edgar Caldwell's execution legal? Could he be executed in Alabama? Or was it a miscarriage of justice, hiding behind the letter of the law? As plans were being made to try and save Edgar's life, plans were also being made to take it. Sheriff W.E. Parker put out a call for bids to build the scaffold that will be used to hang Edgar. E.R. Moore, a local cabinet maker and contractor, won the bid, and Moore took the job seriously. He went out and cut fresh timber and got to work in his shop to make everything and make sure it was ready for the day of execution. Now, this wasn't Moore's first time building a scaffold. In fact, he had constructed several for the county before, including the one that was used to hang another black man, Tim Sharp, just a few years earlier in 1915. Sharp, like Edgar, had been sentenced to death for taking the life of a white man. While Edgar waited for a decision from the court, the NAACP kept fighting, kept getting the word out about his case, kept pushing his name into the national conversation. In the March issue of the Crisis, they ran another story about Edgar, but this time it included a picture. They wanted the world to see him, to see the black man that Alabama and Jim Crow wanted to hang, just for defending himself. That issue of the Crisis made it to Edgar, and when he read it, he was moved. He wrote a letter to the NAACP. He asked them to pray for him, to pray that God would change the president's heart and give him another chance on earth. On April 19, 1920, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling. It was unanimous. The court upheld the lower court's decision, ruling that the state of Alabama had the right to try Edgar Caldwell. Writing for the court, Chief Justice Edward Douglas White, a former Confederate veteran, said that even though the country was technically still at war when the streetcar incident happened, because it occurred inside the state's borders, the Articles of War did not apply. In other words, Edgar wasn't entitled to a military trial. And here's the deepest part, the one that cuts the most. The court said that if the court had ruled in Edgar's favor, it would have stripped the states of too much power, that it would have tipped the balance too far to the federal government. And if you know your American history, then you know this argument, that whenever it came to protecting black people or stopping injustice, the Supreme Court could always be counted on to hide behind the so-called rights of the states. We could always be sacrificed in the name of protecting the balance of power. And with that decision, it was over. Edgar Caldwell would be executed. But still, there was more resistance left, more fight left. Because with the court saying no, and the federal government saying no, there was still one more person who could say yes. Alabama Governor Thomas Kilby. It was a long shot, but it had to be tried. Edgar was scheduled to hang on July 30th, 1920, so his attorneys filed a formal appeal to the governor, requesting clemency. But Kilby, he went out of town to tour Canada, and his deputy refused to act and said that the execution would go forward. Then on July 24th, 1920, just 6 days before the execution, the Alabama State Board of Pardons denied Edgar's petition, unanimously. Then the time came, July 30th, the day set for Edgar's execution. We don't know what Edgar felt in those final hours, whether it was fear or calm or peace. We just don't know. What we do know is this. In the months leading up to his execution, he grew closer to God. And when he walked through the gallows that day, a crowd of more than 2,500 people were waiting for him, waiting to watch, waiting to witness. As they placed the rope around his neck, Edgar sang 2 hymns, and he prayed. Then he recited Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Then the floor dropped beneath him, and Edgar Charles Caldwell's body fell. The rope pulled tight, and 12 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. After Edgar was hanged, his wife Trese made her way to Anniston to retrieve his remains. It was the first time she had been alone with him since he said goodbye in Atlanta back in 1918. The first time she could sit beside him, without guards watching, without bars between them. The first time she could touch him, without someone telling her not to. And he couldn't say anything back, couldn't hold her hand, couldn't whisper her name, because he was gone. Did she speak to him one last time? Did she whisper goodbye to him? We don't know. But what we do know what was taken from her. They didn't just take Edgar's life. They took his love, his care, his warmth, his future with Trese. They didn't just take a man. They took a bond, a promise, and a dream. And Trese was left to carry that weight of what Jim Crow destroyed for the rest of her life. There's a moment in Edgar's story that gives us reason to pause. It's quiet, but it's also very powerful. For us, it's when Edgar stood on the scaffold, rope around his neck, and began to recite Psalm 23. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, it's one of the most quoted passages in Scripture. But when you really sit with it, when you really understand where it came from, you start to see why it's so powerful for us. David wrote that psalm while he was on the run, pursued by a king, surrounded by enemies, targeted by a system that wanted him gone. He was a soldier, trained in war, just like Edgar, trained, decorated, and condemned. Not for a crime, but for standing up for himself, for standing up to injustice. That scaffold wasn't just a place of death. It was his valley. And for black people in this country, we know that valley. We've walked it. We've walked under lynching trees in that valley. We've run from lynch mobs in that valley, sat in courtrooms rigged against us in that valley, looked at Jim Crow signs in that valley, picked cotton and tobacco in that valley, been told that we weren't good enough and didn't belong in that valley. We've buried our dead in that valley, and we've raised our children in it too. And through it all, we survived. We resisted. To say I will fear no evil in a world full of it, that's resistance. To believe that a shepherd still walks with you when you're surrounded by wolves, that's faith and resistance. That's what Edgar was doing right to the end. He was saying, injustice is your truth, but it's not the truth. And that reminded me of something that Dr. King said. It was in 1954, early in his ministry. He gave a sermon called Rediscovering Lost Values. He says something is wrong with society. We've become experts at obeying the laws of science, but we've lost sight of the laws of morality. We're okay with science and technology making the world a neighborhood, he said, but we still won't make it a brotherhood. We know gravity will bring something down if you throw it up. But when it comes to right and wrong, we've lost our compass. And in that sermon, Dr. King quoted the 19th century poet, James Russell Lowell, who wrote, "Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet the scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown. Standeth the God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own." That poem, titled The Present Crisis, was written in 1845 to protest the expansion of slavery into new U.S. territories, and it became a rallying cry for black resistance. The NAACP even named their magazine The Crisis after that poem. The same magazine that published Edgar's story, the same one that put his photo in its pages and said, "This is wrong." So there Edgar was, on the scaffold, surrounded by lies, but full of truth. He walked through the valley. He feared no evil. And even if the state took his life, it could not take the truth. It could not silence the resistance. This story has taught us some things and introduced us to people we may have never heard of before. We started by learning about the Nadir, the lowest point in American race relations. And we ended here, talking about the valley. A valley of injustice, a valley of resistance. Because make no mistake about it, injustice is a valley. Racism is a valley. And we, black people, have been walking through that valley for centuries. And we've resisted it for centuries. We didn't accept it. We still don't. Edgar's life was taken, but that's not all that this story is about, because we know what it means to walk through the valley, that not everyone is going to make it out. But for the ones who do, for the ones still traveling through that weary land, it's our job to carry the story, to remember the journey. And that's why we tell Edgar's story. We tell it to give him dignity, to give him justice, because memory is a form of justice. This is the third story in our Black Resistance series, but we're not done yet. There's still more names to introduce you to, still more resistance to remember. In the next video, we're going to learn about a family who fought back, who resisted together. But before we get there, I want to hear from you. What did you think about Edgar's story? Did you learn something new? Leave me a comment. Let me know what you're thinking. And as always, thank you for walking through this journey with me. See you in the next video.